Welcome, everyone. We're going to just give a minute or so. There's a lot of individuals that have to be let into the virtual room. I'll be a little faster than just a door, but still takes a little time to get everybody in. You're so excited. Welcome to the 2024 Symposium on Substance Use Research. We're already getting applause. That's exciting. I don't know what I did before emojis. All right, maybe 30 more seconds or so, and I'll start with just some housekeeping messages. It looks like it's slowing down a little bit, so I will get started. So, on behalf of the Cobra on Opioids and Overdose at Rhode Island Hospital, the West Virginia Clinical Translational as the director of the Rural Drug Addiction Research Center. I speak for all the leadership teams across the sponsoring centers of the symposium when I say thanks for all those who are presenting and participating in this year's event, including speakers, presenters, panelists, session moderators, abstract reviewers, and the symposium planning committee. This event would not be possible without all of you. Speaking of the amazing planning committee, they have asked me to let you know that we will be sending out an evaluation email at the conclusion of the symposium. Please provide feedback and help us plan next year's event. It's the only way we can get better is if we hear from you. This feedback is also important for our required reporting to the NIH every year. If you have any questions about the symposium, please email our staff at rdar@unl.edu. That's rdar@unl.edu. A few reminders before we begin. The session will be recorded, and we will send an email to registrants and post on social media when the recording is available. Also, this session is a webinar, so attendees, you are muted. But please use the Q&A function to submit questions, and we will answer them as time allows. So with that, I am honored to be introducing our opening keynote symposium speaker for the 2024 symposium. There is a general rule of introductions. The more well-known, less introduction is needed. I am clearly in that space. Dr. George Koob is one of the leading researchers and a world-renowned expert on alcohol and stress and the neurobiology of substance use and addiction. All of our work, basic and applied, has either been directly or indirectly influenced by his research and his rich conceptual and theoretical contributions to the field. I don't know if Dr. Koob recalls this at all, but he accepted my very first publication in behavioral pharmacology when he was an editor of PBB. By the way, I just should say this was like a lot of work, but it was all null effects. So thank you, George, for that. But I will say even more so, since then and to this day, he has been a mentor. He has guided me in my growth, both as an addiction scientist and as a research administrator. He has provided me with encouragement, support, and professional opportunities. So I get to selfishly use this introduction to personally thank him amongst this large audience for everything he has done for me. And I also know that I do not stand alone. There are so many of us out there in the field that owe him the thanks for his generosity and his kindness. So with that, please join me in welcoming the director of the National Institute. Yeah, I'm sorry, George, I messed up on the name here. It disappeared on me. The NIAAA. George, please. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you, Rick. That was very kind, and mentoring you has been always a pleasure, if you want to call it that. I always consider us contemporaries, but is the sound okay? I just want to check. Yeah, I'm assuming so. Okay, so this is my whole talk right here, changing the conversation to include alcohol. And the cartoon says I'm right here in the room and no one even acknowledges me. And I think you'll see as I go through the slides and the talk today, how much we don't know about alcohol in society, and how that is in effect contributing to the pathology associated with alcohol. So, we are NIAAA. We're one of the 27 institutes and center comprising the National Institute of Health, institutes in plural of health, and the largest funder of alcohol research in the world. Our mission is to generate and disseminate fundamental knowledge about the adverse effects of alcohol on health and well-being, and apply that knowledge to improve diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of alcohol-related problems, including alcohol use disorder across the lifespan. So we provide leadership in the national effort to reduce alcohol-related problems. We conduct by the following: conducting and supporting a wide range of basic translational and clinical alcohol research, coordinating and collaborating with other research institutes, agencies, and organizations engaged in alcohol-related work. And then the big one is translating and disseminating research findings to healthcare providers, researchers, policy makers, and the public. And that's probably a big focus of my talk today. So here's what I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to go quickly through each one of these points as we get into the talk, raising awareness about the scope of the problem by tracking drinking trends and consequences, embracing the changing culture around alcohol in society, advancing alcohol screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment as part of routine healthcare, assessing and implementing the addictions neuroclinical assessment framework, which we consider a window on individualized etiology, prevention, and treatment, facilitating medications development, enhancing recovery research, supporting research to integrate alcohol use disorder treatment with treatment for co-occurring conditions. I'm going to talk about liver disease and hepatologists very briefly, combating stigma, advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility in the alcohol field, disseminating NIAAA resources, and I'll probably focus for 1 minute on promoting the widespread use of our healthcare professional core resource on alcohol, which I'll tell you right now is everything you ever wanted to know about alcohol. So let's talk about raising the awareness. So this is one of my favorite quotes from John Kelly and Sarah Wachman at Harvard. It was in a paper they wrote in 2019. Most middle and high income countries globally have become largely inured to the endemic premature mortalities related to more commonly used substances such as alcohol and tobacco. While these account for a much larger number of deaths and economic and social harms and opioids each year, the devastation wreaked by these substances, their casualties, and the associated blood and tears are all relatively willingly absorbed into the social fabric. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but a couple of key points. There are almost 29 million individuals with an alcohol use disorder in the United States. That's 10% of the population. We have a prodigious number of emergency department visits and hospitalizations associated with alcohol. I often say if you go into any major medical center on a Friday or Saturday night, half the people in the emergency room are there because of alcohol. And we lose about 180,000 people a year to alcohol. Some of the things in the box over on the right, in the last few years, the deaths involving alcohol have been actually increasing. Death certificates listing alcohol increased 25% in the first year of the pandemic and another 10% in the second year of the pandemic. And that there's a tail to this. So there, we're only declining 3% in the third year post-pandemic. There were 13,524 alcohol-related traffic fatalities in 2022. This is a third higher than a decade earlier. And, historically, there's been a straight line decline since Reagan signed into law the 21-year-old drinking age, but this is the first time it's reversed. And then this one really gets to me. Intoxicating levels of alcohol are found in 21% of deaths from suicide, 37% from falls, and 31% of drownings. I always say, you shouldn't be climbing a ladder when you're older than 50, and you definitely shouldn't be climbing a ladder when you're older than 50 with a beer in your hand. Alcohol misuse accounts for nearly half of liver disease deaths in each year. Half of liver disease deaths. That's pretty sobering, pun intended. So death certificates listing alcohol as a factor nearly tripled since 2000, and the pandemic just exacerbated all of these issues, and we'll come back to that just for a little bit of time. And then this is a very important slide because it really makes you realize that alcohol misuse is associated with more than 200 different diseases and injury-related conditions. You all know about liver disease. Everybody knows about liver disease and alcohol. But did you know that alcohol causes acute respiratory distress syndrome? Remember, that was a prominent phenotype associated with the pandemic. Alcohol contributes strongly to cardiac arrhythmias and hypertension. I had a Mayo Clinic doctor tell me that the first thing he does now for treating hypertension is check on how much people are drinking. And then, the box on the left, drinking alcohol increases cancer risk. The National Cancer Institute has estimated now that 4 to 6% of cancers are caused by alcohol. And alcohol misuse is actually the third preventable cause of cancer in the United States, with tobacco and being overweight, the other two. What about the scope of the problem? What are some of the trends that I can elaborate a little further, and I'll explain why in a minute. So I'll talk about adolescent alcohol use, women and alcohol, older adults and alcohol, and then the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned. So there's some good news on this slide, some very good news. So over the last 20 years, and I'm not sure people are aware of this, there's been a steady decline in alcohol use in 12 to 20-year-olds. This is underage drinking is going down. And binge drinking has been going down. But there's a catch to this on the negative side, and that is, you'll note that about 2017, 2018, there was a crossover, and females are now drinking more than males for the first time in history. Alcohol is still the most commonly misused substance among youth, although, tobacco is always up there and marijuana seems to be catching up. But another poignant fact is that there's been a developmental shift in when binge drinking actually starts. So for decades, the prevalence of binge drinking across the lifespan peaked with young adults aged 18 to 25. That shifted to the ages 26 to 34, which is shown in this slide on the right-hand side. And you'll note that it's associated with a decline in males, but an increase in females. And again, so we have this convergence of male and female drinking. And that's what's, summarized in this slide. So, for adolescents 12 to 17 and young adults 18 to 25, prevalence of past month alcohol use is decreasing faster for males and females, as I just said, and females in both age groups are now more likely to drink and binge drink than males. And then I already explained 26 to 64. And also in older adults, prevalence of past month alcohol use increased for females, but not for males. So why is this important? Why am I going on about this? Well, one major reason, and one of our major thrusts at NIAAA, is studies suggest that women are more likely than men to experience a variety of alcohol-related harms at comparable doses. They include hangovers, blackouts, liver disease, brain atrophy, cognitive deficits, cardiomyopathy, faster progression of alcohol use disorder development, certain cancers, larger increases in alcohol-related emergency department visits, hospitalizations, and deaths for women than men over the past 20 years. And women are less likely than men to receive treatment for alcohol use disorder. So we call this the risk-severity paradox. Women experience greater harms at lower doses of alcohol over shorter periods of time. There are a lot of reasons for this, but one of which is possibly genetic, hormonal, but others are more likely to do with cultural issues, and also some boring things like pharmacokinetics, which is for the same body weight, women get a higher blood alcohol than men. And I can elaborate on that if anybody has questions. So more research is needed to better understand sex differences in alcohol use and consequences. You know, this was a number of years ago now, 2017, study evaluated 230 structural imaging studies on substance use in general, and only a quarter of them actually evaluated sex differences, even though they included females in the study. And you know now that preclinically we require that females be included. But I ask you and I beg you in your preclinical work, those of you who are preclinical researchers, please analyze the female data, even if it's not significant. What about concerns about alcohol use among the aged population over 65? Well, alcohol affects behavior and health differently as we age. Health consequences of alcohol tend to shift from acute causes, injuries, to chronic causes, as we've already talked about. Older adults are more sensitive to the sedative effects of alcohol, as well as to the effects of alcohol on reaction time, balance, attention, and driving skills. Older adults experience reduction in body weight and body water, leading to higher BALs, blood alcohol levels. They take more medications that interact with alcohol. And most of you are probably aware of this, but just to emphasize, when it comes to any sedative drug, any sedative hypnotic, a sleeping pill, an anti-anxiety pill, and some antihistamines, or an opioid, 2 + 2 = 5 when it comes to respiratory depression and falls. Older adults have increased risk of injury from falls that is compounded by alcohol. And then both alcohol and aging involve widespread inflammation that contribute to cardiovascular diseases and cancer, and they disrupt sleep. And this is a big one. I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just face it. Alcohol causes sleep dysregulation, and sleep dysregulation causes more drinking. So you get into a vicious loop. What about the pandemic? Well, we're still feeling the effects of the pandemic when it comes to alcohol. 1/4 of the population in the US increased drinking during the pandemic. For several measures, women were generally more likely to increase drinking than males. There was a greater increases in quantity of alcohol consumptions were observed among Black and non-white participants, particularly in the United States. And individuals who increased their drinking were more likely to drink to cope with stress. There were a whole variety of alcohol-related harms that increased. The emergency department visits, bullet 1, the incidence of alcohol withdrawal in hospitalized patients, bullet 2, the increase in deaths from alcohol-associated liver disease, as I already illustrated in bullet 3, and a 14% increase in alcohol-related impaired driving fatalities. And then this graph shows, an interesting study in 3 community hospitals in Fresno, California. A retrospective chart review revealed drastic increases in alcohol-related hepatitis requiring hospitalization between 2019 and 2020. This was particularly for women and people under the age of 40. The liver transplant docs are now doing liver transplants in 30-year-olds. And this increase in liver disease, alcohol-associated liver disease, has not diminished. I was just at a meeting that was held in Washington with the liver docs last week, and it's still dramatic increase and shifting to younger individuals. So some of the factors I think are, probably you could all come up with the same conclusions, but a systematic review and meta-analysis examining changes in alcohol use during the pandemic found the factors most consistently associated with the increases in drinking were the following: income loss, financial stress, greater depression or anxiety, greater general psychological distress, greater drinking to cope with stress, home and work factors, greater number of children in the household was associated with increases in drinking. Working remotely was associated with increased drinking. Essential workers were more likely to increase drinking compared to others. Let's face it, our society was just, afflicted with an enormous number of stressors, from fear of getting sick, fear of losing job, isolation. You put it all together and it all forms what we call allostatic loads, which is the cost of stress on our brains, in our case for addiction motivational system. And this leads to the study, and something that we're quite taken with also as a high priority, is the interaction of alcohol and social determinants of health. And the COVID-19 pandemic shined a light on this. A variety of social determinants of health can impact the likelihood of alcohol misuse and alcohol use disorder. The social environment you grow up in, particularly if one of the parents has alcohol use disorder, physical environment, increases in outlet density. Wherever alcohol is more available, there's increases in alcohol misuse. Healthcare services, economic stability, education access and quality. And as I was talking about the cost to our brain's motivational systems, adverse social determinants of health serve as allostatic loads on the body's stress systems, increase vulnerability to mental and physical health conditions, and contribute to health disparities and inequities. Stressors can drive alcohol misuse to cope, which in turn exacerbates the initial problems, further fueling alcohol misuse. If you're not familiar with the term allostasis, it comes from the word homeostasis, but homeostasis is where we return to a set point, like body temperature or blood pressure. Allostasis is when blood pressure starts drifting higher and higher because of chronic stress, okay? In the case of addiction, it's the stress systems and negative emotional systems that drift into higher and higher sensitivity. And then the COVID-19 pandemic also contributed to a global decline in mental health. The World Health Organization estimates the following global changes: about a 28% increase in cases of major depressive disorder, 26% increases in cases of anxiety disorder. The pandemic also worsened already declining mental health in the United States, particularly in young people, and there's a lot of data for that, and you can find that at the National Institute on Mental Health website. Given links between poor mental health and alcohol misuse, one might expect more drinking to cope during the pandemic. And alcohol use disorder is highly comorbid with mental health disorders. It's about 20 to 40% with anxiety, about 30 to 60% with post-traumatic stress disorder. It often precedes diagnoses of mental health conditions. Alcohol misuse is commonly used in an effort to cope with symptoms, as I've emphasized now multiple times. In the end, alcohol misuse makes the prognosis worse. Similarly, mental health conditions complicated treatment for alcohol use disorder. And a couple of years ago, with Nora Volkoff and Larry Tabak, the acting director of NIH, I participated in one of the treatment and illicit drug summits, and then gave a short talk. But the opioid crisis overlaps with other public health challenges such as undertreated chronic pain, mental illness, and alcohol use disorder. But alcohol misuse contributes to both physical and emotional pain, and pain contributes to alcohol misuse through drinking to cope. There are overlapping brain mechanisms in chronic pain, alcohol use disorder, and opioid use disorder. A critical understanding of this relationship provides an opportunity for preventing and treating these symptoms and these problems. I was telling Rick, I just was at a meeting in Tucson hosted by Frank Parecka and colleagues on pain and opioid addiction. And addressing alcohol misuse in individuals with chronic pain, opioid use disorder, or both may help improve patient outcomes. What about changing the culture around alcohol in society? Well, I've given you a lot of bad news, but there's actually some good news, and it's particularly in the younger generation, which is the increased interest in the Sober Curious movement, Dry January, Sober October, alcohol-free options highlight a cultural shift. Sober October is encouraging individuals to question Sober Curious is encouraging individuals to question their relationship with alcohol and explore benefits of of reducing or eliminating alcohol. We have Dry January. I do a whole day of interviews with the press across the country on Dry January. And the bottom line is, I'm quoting myself here in the center of this slide. Dry January helps us evaluate our relationship with alcohol. If you stop drinking in the month of January and you suddenly feel better, then your body is trying to tell you something. So you should listen to your body. The bottom line is, if you feel better when you're not drinking, that your body's trying to tell you something. You should listen to it. And then, the other thing that's going on is dry bars, mocktails, alcohol-free beverages. And finally, one other thing I want to mention to you, I'll talk about stigma later, but there should be no stigma attached to going to a party and not drinking. And alcohol-free beverages should be available at all parties and gatherings and social events and medical society meetings. What's wrong with having a sparkling water and a lime available for people that don't want to drink, or some non-alcohol beverage or soda? So what are some of the things we're doing about all of this? Well, I'm going to start with promoting alcohol screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. So what is the value? So the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommends alcohol screening and brief intervention or counseling in primary care settings for adults aged 18 and over. We promote screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment as part of routine healthcare for both adolescents and adults. Screening for alcohol misuse can help clinicians spot other physical and mental health related issues. For example, adults who binge drink are more likely than drinkers who do not binge drink to have past year suicidal ideation, episodes of major depression, or misuse of prescription pain medication. Screening is being done now by a lot of primary care docs. But the real problem we see is there's no brief intervention. There's no recommendation or advice given. And I'll show you that in this slide. It's a nice study done by Carrie Mintz showing that screening often occurs, but there's little advice and referral for people who with an alcohol use disorder. So you can see here in people utilizing healthcare in the past 12 months, there's 81%, used healthcare, but 70% were actually screened. But when you get to brief intervention and referral to treatment, it plummets. And while alcohol screening is common, there's very little of this brief intervention referral to treatment. What is a brief intervention? Well, it's a short version of motivational interviewing, basically, where if you're a hepatologist seeing somebody, you basically, or a cardiologist seeing someone, you basically say something like, well, your arrhythmia, Joe, or Sally, could be linked to the fact that you seem to be drinking quite a bit, which is significantly possible, okay? So in the US, women appear to have lower odds of receiving brief intervention for unhealthy alcohol use across all age groups, particularly middle age. And Black and Latina Hispanic women appear to be less likely to receive brief intervention than women in other race ethnicity groups. So, it's something that should be done and can be done. We think of it as a vital sign, because identifying an alcohol problem shines a window on many, the 200 different other disorders. So you could, save a ton in healthcare costs if you actually screened and did a brief intervention for alcohol, because alcohol is the root cause of a lot of problems that people go to their primary doctor for. Okay, now I'm going to jump into some of the areas that were, more theoretical that we're working on. One is the addictions neuroclinical assessment framework. I think most of you who are in the addiction field have somewhere seen the 3-stage, 3-domain dysfunction, 3 neural circuits associated with addiction very quickly. As a review, there's the binge intoxication stage. It involves incentive salience and pathological habits. It's mediated largely by circuits in the basal ganglia, illustrated in the blue blob. There's the withdrawal negative affect stage that involves reward deficits and stress circuit or increases in stress, mediated largely by the extended amygdala, the red blob. And then executive function deficits, including impulsivity, failure to delay reinforcement, mediated in the preoccupation anticipation, or if you prefer, the the craving stage, and mediated largely by the green blob of the prefrontal cortex. And, this is a slide that I usually dedicate to Lauren Parsons, who made the first version, and then I borrowed it from, we lost Larry Parsons way too early. He was a researcher at Scripps Research. But I just want you to realize that, we don't deny that reward is a key part of the initial part of the addiction cycle. But another source of reinforcement kicks in, which is relief of the untoward effects caused by alcohol withdrawal from stopping drinking. And I just want to point out that even when one enters the preoccupation, anticipation, of the craving stage, when one relapses or returns to drinking, you don't enter through the reward system, you enter through the relief system for the most part. And anyone of you who have worked with animal models know that exactly the same thing happens with rodents. Once they've become, if you'll permit me, quote unquote, addicted, they return to that kind of drug-seeking behavior very quickly, much more quickly than the initial uptake. So when I came to NIAAA, a group of us got together and thought that we could use this framework to develop what we call the Addictions Neuroclinical Assessment Framework for Improved Diagnosis, Prevention, and Treatment. The goals of the ANA were to identify how the 3 domains of dysfunction influence differences between people diagnosed with AUD, which then can be used to guide treatment decisions to better understand the difference between individuals with and without alcohol use disorder. So we were talking about the 3 blue circles here: incentive salience, negative emotionality, and executive function. We hypothesized that if we did a series of neuropsychological tests, possibly like the ones I've outlined here, cue reactivity for incentive salience, delayed discounting for executive function, or scales and things like the Beck Depression Inventory or subscales of the Beck Depression Inventory, that we could, in some way identify people who entered the addiction cycle through one of the different stages. You don't have to enter through the binge intoxication stage, and the COVID-19 pandemic emphasized to us that you can enter through the withdrawal negative affect stage. So we all got together to plan a protocol that has been effected at NIH, and we did it in collaboration with NIDA. But at that meeting, Nora Volkoff said, well, we've already had patients that have gone through the clinical center. So in a large, diverse clinical sample representing the spectrum of alcohol use disorder, we tested the hypothesis that the 3 neurobiological domains proposed to be critical to the addiction cycle could be identified through factor analysis. Measures of addiction, personality, cognition, behavior, and exposure to early life stress were collected in 454 patients back in, I think it was 2015 and 16. The study confirmed the relevance of the 3 neurofunctional domains to alcohol use disorder using factor analysis and using a more sophisticated statistical package, multiple indicators, multiple causes approach. Early life stress and socio-demographic factors were identified as predictors. So this is a study that Laura Quacco published when she was part of the intramural program. But I want to emphasize to you that this study has been replicated now in 6 different studies that are published in the literature. And those 3 domains always fall out: incentive salience, negative emotionality, and executive function. So you could say, so what? I mean, what's the point, Koob? Well, the point is, we believe it reduces stigma. Alcohol use disorder is considered a brain disorder that can be treated, and you can recover. It individualizes diagnosis and treatment. We're hoping it facilitates treatment based on individual differences in which domain one enters the addiction cycle. Think of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and someone who entered the addiction cycle through the preoccupation anticipation stage. That's going to completely change how you might medicate or treat with a behavioral treatment that individual. Facilitates recovery, provides a framework to help clinicians identify individuals with domain-specific vulnerabilities, both genetic and environmental. Provided a framework to help clinicians focus on the different triggers for relapse, but also for prevention, provides a framework for identifying individuals with domain-specific vulnerabilities, both genetic and environmental. For example, high scores in the negative emotionality domain showed significant associations with more frequent and heavier drinking and drinking to regulate negative affect, and a nice study from the Wickowitz laboratory by Dr. Votaw. What else are we doing? Well, we're trying to facilitate medications development. We have a whole series of programs that we pay for. I want to emphasize that. We pay for all of these. And we call this our NIAAA Alcohol Pharmacotherapy Evaluation Program. So if you have a small business that's interested in some form of treatment or diagnosis or prevention for alcohol use disorder, we have the Small Business Innovation Research and the Small Business Technology Transfer programs to facilitate studies leading to FDA IND applications, investigational new drug applications. We have human laboratory screening studies that bridge the gap between preclinical and clinical trials. We have an NIAAA clinical investigations group. We conduct a fast fail phase 2 clinical trial with 18 months turnaround time. This is a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial in multiple sites. We do one of these every 1.5 years, and we pay for it. Usually the pharmaceutical company provides the drug. We have also recently instituted an NIAAA alcohol interaction program, conducts alcohol medication interactions studies, which are required by the FDA before you can give a drug to a human. And then our intramural program also conducts clinical studies on novel compounds with alcohol use disorder treatment potential. All of this is on our website. You're certainly welcome to contact our Division of Treatment and Recovery because they'll fill you in on any details. But one of the things I want to emphasize is, yes, at NIAAA, we do the classical drug development, molecular targets, animal models, human laboratory models, clinical trials, but we're also emphasizing back translation as a key element of this framework. So taking what we learned from clinical trials and human laboratory studies and informing the animal models, validating the animal models, also validating the molecular targets. So it's an ongoing, really iterative, what we call Rosetta Stone approach. This is led in our basic research by our Division of Neuroscience and Behavior to quite a few targets for all 3 stages of the addiction cycle. I'm showing you ones for the withdrawal negative affect stage, that reverse hyperkatifia, a word I made up to describe the negative emotional state of alcohol withdrawal and protracted alcohol withdrawal. But you can see the neurotransmitters in the pro-stress modulators that are targets. We have drugs that block these receptors or inactivate these functions of these systems in animal models. We also have anti-stress modulators that buffer the stress modulators for the withdrawal negative affect stage. And we have drugs that interact with those candidates as well. And these are the same systems that we use when you almost get hit by a car walking across the, jaywalking on the street, and you get back to safety and you realize that, your body has changed, your nasal passages are clear, your heart rate's up. You can think of that experiment you were dreaming about when you stepped out in front of the traffic. These neurotransmitter systems are the ones that are engaged. But in addiction, they're pathologically overengaged. And then the buffers are the ones that bring you back to homeostasis after you've made a fool of yourself walking out in front of traffic. And those are the anti-stress modulators. But there are other challenges. We call these the valley of death. You have to go through all these stages, safety stages, the double-blind placebo-controlled trial stage, then uptake by big pharma. And you can see we lose drugs all along the way before we get to approval by the FDA. And I just want to remind you that if you look into literature, you'll see that the drug naltrexone took 15 years from the first rodent study to get approved by the FDA, and the drug acamprosate took, I think, about 17 years to get approved from the first rodent study to approval by the FDA. Those are both FDA-approved medications for the treatment of alcohol use disorder. One of the things we've been working on with Ray Litton and colleagues is broadening the endpoints for approval of medications for alcohol use disorder. And we hope that this will spur progress. Current FDA clinical endpoints for phase 2 trials are total abstinence, which is the original, Some of you may or may not know that we got that changed about 5 or 6 years ago to also include no heavy drinking days. But these endpoints don't take into consideration the amount of alcohol consumed prior to treatment and may limit the development of medications that improve how a patient feels and functions. So a new endpoint that's being considered is a reduction in the World Health Organization drinking levels, very high, high, moderate, low, defined as a mean alcohol consumption per day. And this work was a collaborative effort with academia and IAAA and the FDA and other organizations in the government. What about enhancing recovery research? So most people who need treatment receive no treatment of any kind, and little is known about what sustains longer recovery. About 10% of individuals with an alcohol use disorder actually get treatment, and it's much less than that for a medication. So we're expanding our focus on longer-term recovery at NIAAA. And we've defined recovery from alcohol use disorder based on qualitative feedback from key recovery specialists, stakeholders, researchers, clinicians, and recovery specialists. Recovery is viewed as both a process of behavioral change and an outcome that incorporates time periods for two key components: remission from the DSM-5 alcohol use disorder criteria, of which many of you know are 11 criteria, and cessation from heavy drinking, which is a non-abstinent recovery outcome. We also emphasize the importance of biopsychosocial functioning and quality of life in enhancing recovery outcomes. And just to give you an example of how this is impacting the field, in a really nice study by Katie Wickowitz and her colleagues, they showed that greater relief negative emotionality at baseline predicted greater drinking intensity and more frequent heavy drinking during recovery. So the study validated the 3 domains of the 3-stage addiction cycle. As I mentioned earlier, this was one of those 6 studies. The addiction cycle domains were more strongly associated with outcomes than AUD symptoms. I'll repeat that. The addiction cycle domains are more strongly associated with outcomes than the AUD symptoms. And then using measures from Project Match and Combine, the results of this study supported the utility of the domains in predicting AUD treatment outcomes and recovery 1 year post-treatment. At 1 year follow-up, relief negative emotion scores were associated with drinks per day and % heavy drinking days. And that is the beta score for the relief negative emotionality metric. And the beta coefficient, as you know, is the degree of change in outcome variable for every 1 unit change in the predictor variable. So, I think if we put more emphasis on recovery and we start categorizing people by the symptoms that are driving their recovery, I think we have a much better shot at improving our success rate. Other things we're doing within our portfolio of recovery research include neurobehavioral markers and predictors associated with long-term trajectories of recovery. It includes understanding the mechanisms of behavioral change associated with recovery outside of treatment. It includes factors associated with different phases of recovery, such as peer helping and social networks. It includes assessing the benefits of secular and mutual help organizations in sustaining recovery. I don't know whether you know it, but there's also a secular Alcoholics Anonymous. I've met with them several times, and they are really a really fascinating group of people based all over the world. Hepatologists are changing the conversation about alcohol and liver disease. I mentioned some of this. Alcohol misuse accounts for nearly half of liver disease deaths each year in the United States. Alcohol-associated liver disease is the most common alcohol-related cause of death and the leading cause of liver transplantation. Alcohol-associated liver disease deaths increased 47% in the last 20 years. Rates are increasing, I've mentioned this, for women and young adults. So there's a paradigm shift going on, which we call integrated treatment of alcohol-associated liver disease and alcohol use disorder can improve patient outcomes. Treating alcohol use disorder with medications reduces the likelihood of developing alcohol-associated liver disease and the progression of existing alcohol-associated liver disease. And behavioral or pharmacotherapy for AUD can, after discharge from hospitalization for alcohol-associated liver disease reduces readmission and deaths. And you can see here the slide of the deaths associated with a 47% increase in the last 20 years. What about early liver transplants for alcohol-associated liver disease? Currently, many U.S. transplant centers typically require 6-month period of alcohol abstinence prior to liver transplantation. The reason for this is to select patients who will be more likely to abstain from alcohol after transplant and to exclude patients from transplant who might improve and not require transplant. It's not really realistic in the sense that in severe alcohol-associated hepatitis, a majority of patients' deaths occur within 2 months of diagnosis. So data suggests that patients who receive a liver transplant without the 6-month waiting period, which we call early liver transplant, have a similar survival outcomes and alcohol-related relapse rates as patients who receive a transplant after 6-month waiting period. So to build on this research, we've issued a request for applications to encourage studies on factors that influence the selection, management, and outcomes of patients who receive early liver transplantation. And I mention this because I feel we can do this with every one of the 200 different conditions that is comorbid with alcohol use disorder. What about combating stigma in the alcohol field? So words matter. We can help to alleviate the stigma associated with alcohol-related conditions by consistently using non-pejorative, non-stigmatizing language to describe these concerns and the people who are affected by them. So you've heard me say this throughout: use alcohol use disorder instead of alcohol abuse, alcohol dependence, and alcoholism. Use alcohol misuse instead of alcohol abuse when referring broadly to drinking in a manner that could cause harm. Use first-person language to describe people with alcohol-related problems. A person with alcohol use disorder instead of alcoholic. Person in recovery instead of recovering alcoholic. And use alcohol-associated liver disease instead of alcoholic liver disease. I don't even use the word alcoholic beverage anymore. I'll just say alcohol-containing beverage. What about advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in alcohol research? You already heard about some of the disparities that we've identified that occurred during the pandemic. We recognize that supporting and advancing best science depends on a diverse and talented scientific and administrative workforce. Enhancing our understanding of the issues surrounding underserved and underrepresented populations is essential for promoting health equity and ensuring that NIAAA supported research benefits everybody. We now have a scientific diversity officer, Dawn Wayman, who has joined us to advance our goals in this domain. Some recent efforts to strengthen our efforts include pursuing new opportunities to address gaps in minority health and health disparities research, leveraging our intramural training program to advance diversity and inclusion in the scientific workforce, requiring that alcohol research centers include a formal plan for enhancing diverse perspectives in research proposals, promoting collaborative partnerships between research centers and minority-serving institutions and alcohol research centers to strengthen research capacity and scientific workforce and minority-serving institutions. We know that, diversity actually increases innovativeness in research, and we want to capitalize on that. And finally, I'm going to end with our resources. I want you to listen carefully. If you type in what's on this slide, NIAAA, to any search engine, you will come to our website. And on our website, you're going to find all of this. So we have a website for the public, Rethinking Drinking website and print publications for general audience to help individuals assess their drinking habits and find ways to make a change. We have College Aim, which is if you're sending Johnny or Sally to a college or university, you might want to look at this, even though it's oriented toward college administrators. It's a comprehensive information on prevention approaches found to be effective in college environments, both individual prevention efforts and community prevention efforts. The Alcohol Treatment Navigator is an online resource that helps individuals understand and search for treatment options, including telehealth services. It also includes a portal to assist healthcare providers in making referrals for their patients. Believe it or not, you can type in your zip code and you will come to, in one of the listing services, such as the one by SAMHSA, and there's one by Psychology Today. And you will actually find a treatment provider in your zip code area. These are called locators. So the SAMHSA locator and the Psychology Today locator. In addition, you can find out what is an alcohol use disorder, that it's a spectrum disorder, what are the criteria, and you can find out what treatments are appropriate for what stage of the alcohol use disorder you're in, mild, moderate, or severe. And then finally, the healthcare professional core resources, something basically we worked on. People ask, what did you do during the pandemic? Well, we did this. And this is an online educational resource that covers the basics of what every healthcare professional needs to know about alcohol, including the many ways that alcohol can impact a patient's health, and provide strategies for alcohol screening and interventions. There's 14 units to this. You can get CME credit. It's oriented toward primary care docs, but it should be good for pharmacists, health nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, clinical psychologists, to board certified addiction medicine specialists. It really is literally everything you ever wanted to know about alcohol. We also have information for the public on drinking and its impact in plain language. We have materials that are available in English and Spanish, and select content that translated into more than a dozen languages. You can, again, visit our website to find many of these. And we publish a newsletter that features articles and news updates on NIAAA in the alcohol field. You can sign up for this and receive this on a regular basis. And finally, we publish our own journal. It's called Alcohol Research Current Reviews. It's been out there now for 50 years. It's published on an online continuous rolling basis, covers a wide variety of research topics and disciplines through invited reviews. We occasionally will take a walk on, but most of our reviews are invited. It's a place I go to find the latest information on a topic. If I'm writing a paper and I need some particular information on alcohol-associated hepatitis or steatosis. And believe it or not, it has a pretty good impact factor of 9.4. So that's pretty much it. I think I'm pretty much on time. I was aiming for around a 45-minute talk. I would like NIAAA to be your source for credible, evidence-based resources on alcohol's effects on health. Putting these slides and facts together, it takes a village. And so, the list is here, but importantly, the individuals from our science policy branch, Laura Brockway-Lenardi, Fred Donadeo, Laura Minella, and Bridget Williams-Simmons, who really helped with my slides. And my slides are available if you want them from NIAAA. And then, my stats research person, Aaron White, and the others listed here, Kathy Young and Laura Quacco and Svetlana Radeva and Gregory Roa. So thank you very much.
Thank you, George. That was amazing. Really appreciate everything. We have a few minutes for questions. So please, as has been put in the chat several times, drop your questions into the Q&A. And we have one right now that I'm going to read for you, George. How do you combat the public perception that earlier clinical research showed that moderate drinking can improve cardiovascular health? Those industry-sponsored research publications have left the public totally confused about the no amount of alcohol is good for your body.
Yeah, so I mean, it is a challenge. More and more, though, you'll see articles where this observation has been questioned. We emphasize two things. One is that the control group that was used, used to be abstainers, and we know that there, a large proportion of individuals who abstain from drinking are actually ill from drinking, and so that throws the results more in the direction of a positive effect. When you account for that, You find that everything washes out. The J-shaped curve doesn't exist for the most part. Oh, there's some esoteric small things that are beneficial, but I can tell you for a fact that arrhythmias and hypertension now are critically caused in part by alcohol, or certainly exacerbated by alcohol. So it's something to be significantly aware of, and we're trying to focus on that. So, we basically think it washes out. I mean, the other part is, pretty much the evidence is that it's the Mediterranean diet that people partake of that's actually beneficial, because the amount of resveratrol in red wine, you'd have to drink a dozen bottles a day to get that amount of resveratrol to prevent cancer. So, I think there's a lot of reasons why the media are starting to pick up on and public. I mean, I think the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times recently, a whole number of outlets have been picking up on the fact that there really is no beneficial effects from alcohol that we're aware of on health.
Thank you, George. Another question. Excellent talk. Can you provide the recent insights into neuroimmune signaling and the effects of alcohol on brain plasticity inform the development of targeted interventions for individuals with alcohol use disorder, especially considering genetic and epigenetic predispositions?
Wow, you got a whole course in that question.
There's a lot there.
I'll
Great
cut
job.
to the chase. I'll cut to very good point. Both questions, very good questions. So there is a genetic component to alcohol use disorder. It's about 50, 60% heritable, just as all substance use disorders. And we're identifying some of the genes that are involved, but there's a big thrust on epigenetic factors, and you're absolutely correct. So, that's one of the areas that we'll be looking at, this interplay between the environment and the genes and how those genes are transcribed, among other things. The neuroimmune function and immune function is a big hot area in alcohol research and basic research. We know that it plays a role in depression, and particularly in what I call the negative affect stage, and the domain and the withdrawal negative affect stage. And so, there's already some work ongoing with in preclinical studies and even some clinical laboratory studies and clinical trials that indicate a hint of an effect with some anti-immune agents. So, fingers crossed that this, but it's a very active area of research, both preclinically and clinically now in NIH in general, but in NIAAA. I know NIDA has a big program on this, and so does NIMH. So a very good question.
Thank you. The next one is great talk as always. Shopa Bush from IDARS here, wondering what interest does NIAAA have in assessing the molecular interplay of alcohol and drugs such as cocaine or opiates?
Well, we're quite interested in the interaction with opiates and alcohol. I mean, it is a challenge to get be honest with you, because we always have challenges when people have one foot in one domain and one foot in another domain when it comes to grant applications and so forth. But I would think that it would be well received at NIH if you have a really important hypothesis about the interactions. And we certainly, I can just tell you frankly that my laboratory, I have a preclinical basic research laboratory in the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And one of the things we're looking at is the interaction between alcohol and opiates in respiratory depression, and trying to find ways of reverse the respiratory depression, which is exacerbated by alcohol. And you can go to the literature if you want, but I can tell you that there's very little work done on that interaction. So it's wide open, is what I would say, wide open. Cocaine, there's been old work on cocaethylene, which, is a metabolite that seems to be formed by alcohol and cocaine interactions, but it's kind of died out. I think one of the reasons may be that the translational potential hasn't worked out or just hasn't been pursued. But, could be equally important, because people will drink to help modify some of the anxiety-like states that are engendered during cocaine withdrawal, not during the crash, but after the crash. And so you can just imagine the interaction occurring there.
Thank you. George, do you have time for two more questions? Are you okay?
I have as much time as you need.
Wonderful, wonderful. We really appreciate everything. So are there movements, mandates to increase SUD or OUD or alcohol use disorder education, training, and intervention curriculum to better prepare physicians to interact with patients in the clinic?
Another excellent question, and the answer is yes. It's the short answer. We're working on something that is actively engaged in right now, what I call a core resource for training medical students. And I'm hoping it'll be about 20 to 30 minutes long. And it's been distilled out of the healthcare professional core resource. The conundrum we're in is the catch-22, okay? Because the people that make up the exam say it's not in the curriculum, and the people in the curriculum say it's not on the exam. So you guys know the gig there. But we're going to be pushing this hard, and the American College of Addiction, what's it called? The American ACAM. I always forget what it all stands for. You can look it up. ACAAM is very much involved in training, board certification in addiction medicine, which is now part of preventive medicine board certification, and they have fellowships every state of the union at this point, and they're doing a fabulous job. That's the trickle down part. We're trying to move it from the bottom up with educating medical students. So we're on it, I hope.
There has been an effort to improve illicit drugs listed on death certificates to better understand overdose deaths. Has this also changed how alcohol-involved deaths are reported?
That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer. But if you email me, I'll ask Aaron White, who takes care of this, of mining all the data sets for me. But I believe it is correct that it is also, that's why we have that listing of death certificates during the pandemic that seemed pretty accurate and reflective of what's going on. I think the answer is yes, but I'm not entirely sure.
And we had a third one sneak in, if you're okay, George. Just wanting you to talk a little bit more about genetic factors that influence susceptibility to alcohol use disorder.
Okay, well, the two main genetic genes that fall out are always the two alcohol metabolizing genes. So alcohol dehydrogenase and alcohol associated acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. And so they are more or less a protective factor in many individuals. There are quirks with some of them that could make you more vulnerable. But you're familiar with the flush reaction. It's more prominent in individuals from Southeast Asia who are in America or have a family history from Southeast Asia. And so they can get a pretty severe flush reaction if they're homozygote for alteration in that gene. But even a heterozygote can get a flush reaction that's pretty aversive, increase in heart rate and blood pressure and possibly nausea and being uncomfortable. Basically like taking Antabuse or disulfiram. So those are two. Some of the other genes that have fallen out are actually in the domain of my first love, which is the stress system. There's CRF and some associated with immune function. There are some genes that we know are associated with the initial actions of alcohol, like potassium channels, that have fallen out in some of the GWAS studies. So I'm working on having our consortium on the genetics of alcoholism get on their website a little more of the information, but they have a pretty nice website educating people on genetics and alcohol use disorder in general. But hopefully we'll have more of the specific information that I mentioned out there for you in the near future.
Thank you. Everybody, please join me in thanking Dr. Koob again for a fabulous presentation. I know the crowd would be going crazy right now if we were live, George, I have no doubt. You can see all the applause happening, huge group. So thank you so much for everything. We really appreciate the time you spent with us answering questions and the offer to answer other questions by email and everything. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing everybody at our other events.
Thank you, Rick. Great to see you. And sorry I couldn't be there in person, everybody, but maybe next time something comes up. Okay, bye, everybody.